On his wedding day, a millionaire anxiously awaits to see his ex suffer as she witnesses his happiness. But she arrives accompanied by 3 children identical to him, revealing a secret that changes everything. The luxurious event transforms into chaos, and hidden truths begin to surface. Now he must face the past and decide between pride and the chance to rebuild his life. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. The Wilson mansion gleamed under the afternoon sun of Boston, its windows reflecting the characteristic orange hue of New England autumn. Richard Wilson, 35, CEO of one of the country's most promising startups, observed his family's property with a satisfied smile on his lips. In his hands he held a golden envelope, identical to the other 200 that would be sent to the cream of American society. But this one, in particular, had a special meaning. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" Barbara Lawson, his mentor and right-hand woman in business, asked with her usual caution. At 50, she was the embodiment of elegance and discretion, characteristics that made her indispensable for the meteoric growth of the company. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life, Barbara," he replied, without taking his eyes off the envelope where the name Emily Carter was written in impeccable calligraphy. "After 6 years, the time has finally come." Barbara discreetly adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses, a gesture she always made when she was uncomfortable with a situation. "Does Melissa know you're inviting your ex-girlfriend to the wedding?" Richard turned to face her, his green eyes shining with an almost feverish intensity. "Melissa trusts me completely. Besides, she knows that Emily is part of the past, a past that needs to be properly closed." In the next room, Melissa Foster, Richard's fiancée, was supervising the final details of the wedding decoration that would take place in 2 weeks. Daughter of one of the largest textile businessmen in the United States, Melissa was the epitome of Boston sophistication. Her long black hair was tied in an elegant bun, and her Vera Wang dress perfectly molded her slender silhouette. "The flower arrangements need to be more voluminous," she instructed the decorator. "I want every inch of this mansion to reflect the grandeur of the moment." Richard observed his fiancée from a distance, admiring her efficiency. Melissa was perfect in all aspects, beautiful, intelligent, well-connected. Their marriage would be the union of 2 business empires, further consolidating his position in the market. But there was something more, something that only Barbara knew. It was the final piece of his meticulously architected plan. "Will the invitations be sent today?" Barbara asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Yes, all of them. And I want this one," he raised the envelope with Emily's name, "to be delivered personally. I hired a special messenger for that. I want to make sure she receives it." Barbara felt a shiver run down her spine. In 6 years as Richard's mentor, she had seen him transform a small startup into a technological empire. She had also seen how Emily's abandonment had changed him, how that idealistic young man had transformed into a calculating and determined man. She knew there was more to that invitation than simply inviting an ex-girlfriend to his wedding. "Do you really think she'll come?" Barbara questioned, carefully observing her protégé's reaction. An enigmatic smile formed on Richard's lips. "She'll come, Barbara. Emily has always been predictable in her stubbornness. She won't resist the opportunity to see me again, especially under these circumstances. And when she shows up..." His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence incomplete, but Barbara knew that tone well. It was the same one he used before closing. A big deal before acquiring a competing company. It was the tone of someone who had all the cards up his sleeve and was about to show his winning hand. What Richard didn't know was that at that exact moment, miles away, in a modest apartment on the outskirts of New York City, Emily Carter was finishing another day of work as a literature teacher. Her brown hair, now shorter than when she was dating Richard, framed a face that maintained the same sweetness from years ago, although her eyes revealed a maturity acquired through experiences that no one could imagine. On her living room table, dozens of her students' essays awaited correction, but her attention was focused on 3 small figures, playing on the living room rug. 3 identical faces, 3 smiles that were perfect reflections of each other, and of someone she had tried to contact tirelessly for 6 long years. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. Emily couldn't imagine that, on the other side of the door, a messenger was holding a golden envelope that was about to completely change the course of their lives. Emily stared at the golden envelope in her hands, feeling the weight of the imported paper and the elegant calligraphy that composed her name. Her fingers trembled slightly as they slid over the satin surface. The messenger had already left minutes ago, but she remained standing in the same place as if time had frozen at that moment. "Mom, who was at the door?" The voice of Luke, one of the triplets, brought her back to reality. He observed her with his intense green eyes, so similar to his father's. "Just a delivery, sweetie," she replied, discreetly putting the envelope in the desk drawer. "Have you finished your homework?" "Mark and Peter have already finished, but I'm still having trouble with math," Luke admitted, lowering his eyes. It was always like this. His brothers advanced easily while he struggled with the numbers that seemed to dance before his eyes. Emily approached her son, stroking his dark hair. "Don't worry, we'll solve this together. And don't forget that tomorrow we have an appointment with Dr. Johnson." Luke's face lit up at the mention of the neurologist. "Dr. Johnson promised to show me some new tricks to memorize the multiplication tables." Emily smiled, observing how her most introverted son transformed when talking about the doctor who had been accompanying him for months. Dr. Daniel Johnson had become more than a specialist. He was a family friend, a constant presence that brought security and hope to Luke. Later, after the boys had gone to sleep, Emily finally gathered the courage to open the envelope. The invitation was exactly as she had imagined, ostentatious, elegant, worthy of the pages of society magazines. The words danced before her eyes. "Richard Wilson and Melissa Foster invite you to their wedding." Her hands automatically reached for her cell phone, dialing a familiar number. After a few rings, a welcoming voice answered on the other end. "Emily? Did something happen?" "Daniel, sorry for calling so late." She took a deep breath. "I received an invitation today from Richard to his wedding." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "The boy's father? After all this time?" "Yes." Emily ran her hand through her hair, a nervous gesture she always made in moments of anxiety. "For 6 years I tried to contact him in every possible way. Emails, phone calls, letters. Everything seemed to be blocked by an invisible force. And now this. Do you think it's some kind of provocation?" "Knowing Richard as I knew him, yes. He must think I'm alone, devastated. He probably wants to see me suffer on his perfect wedding day." Daniel remained silent for a few moments, thoughtful. "And what do you intend to do?" A determined smile formed on Emily's lips. "I'm going to accept the invitation, Daniel, but not in the way he expects. It's time for Richard to meet his children." "Are you sure? The boys are sensitive, especially Luke. A situation like this can be very intense for them." Emily stood up, walking to the room where the triplets were sleeping. In the dimness, she could distinguish the 3 calm breaths, the angelic faces that carried the features of the father they had never known. "They deserve to know the truth, Daniel. And Richard. He needs to face the consequences of his actions, or rather of his absence." On the other end of the line, Daniel sighed. "You know you can count on me. I'll be by your side whatever you need." The neurologist's words brought a familiar comfort to her heart. In recent months, Daniel had become her confidant, a safe harbor amid the turbulence of raising 3 children alone. "Thank you, Daniel. We'll talk more tomorrow at Luke's appointment." After hanging up, Emily returned to the living room and picked up the invitation again. She observed the date. 2 weeks. Enough time to prepare the boys, to plan every detail. Richard wanted to make a spectacle of her on his big day. Well, she would ensure it was an unforgettable spectacle, but not for the reasons he imagined. On the living room wall, a photo of the triplets on their last birthday caught her attention. Dressed identically, their smiles revealed 3 small gaps in the same places, another characteristic inherited from their father. Emily gently touched the photograph, remembering the day she discovered she was pregnant, the countless frustrated attempts at contact, the sleepless nights wondering why Richard had simply disappeared. "It's time for you to meet your father, my loves," she murmured to the photograph. "And it's time for Richard Wilson to discover that his revenge will cost much more than he imagines." Barbara Lawson walked through the corridors of Wilson Tech with the impeccable posture that characterized her. Her heels echoed on the marble floor as she headed to her office on the top floor of the building. It was early, but she already carried the weight of a decision that had tormented her for 6 years. As she entered her office, her eyes were automatically drawn to the bottom drawer of her desk, the one that always remained locked. There she kept hundreds of printed emails, never delivered letters, and records of blocked calls. 6 years of secrets, of choices that she justified as necessary for Richard's and the company's good. "Ms. Lawson," her assistant interrupted her thoughts, "Mrs. Foster is here for the meeting about the prenuptial contracts." Melissa entered, the room like a gust of spring wind, elegant in her Chanel suit and Louboutin heels. "Barbara, we need to talk about something beyond the contracts." Barbara gestured for Melissa to sit down, maintaining her neutral expression. "Any problem with the wedding preparations?" "It's about the invitation to Emily Carter." Melissa went straight to the point, her dark eyes fixed on Barbara. "Why is Richard so obsessed with having her present? Is there something I should know?" Barbara's heart accelerated slightly, but years of experience in negotiations helped her maintain her composure. "Emily is part of Richard's past, a chapter that he needs to definitively close. You were here when they broke up, weren't you?" Melissa leaned forward. "What really happened? Richard never talks about it, but I notice how he changes when her name is mentioned." Barbara stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of Boston. She remembered that morning 6 years ago when she found the first email from Emily informing about the pregnancy. Richard's startup was about to receive a crucial investment, a moment that would change everything. A baby at that moment could ruin everything. "Emily simply left," Barbara lied, the words leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "Some people aren't prepared for the kind of commitment that a person like Richard demands." Melissa raised an eyebrow, not entirely convinced. "And why invite her now? Why not leave the past in the past?" "Sometimes we need to confront our ghosts to move forward," Barbara replied, sitting back down. "Believe me, Melissa, after the wedding, all of this will be just a distant memory." At that same moment, in his office a few floors above, Richard was absorbed in old photographs on his laptop. Images from 6 years ago, him and Emily in Cape Cod, on the streets of New York, in the gardens of his family's mansion. His finger hovered over the delete button, but he couldn't press it. "Mr. Wilson," his secretary interrupted through the intercom, "the development team is waiting for the new project presentation." Richard closed the laptop abruptly. "I'm on my way." In the hallway he met Barbara, who was heading to the meeting room. The invitation was delivered, she informed, studying his reaction. "Great," he replied, adjusting his Hermes tie. "In 2 weeks, everything will be resolved." Barbara felt a tightness in her chest. If Richard knew that Emily had tried to contact him dozens, hundreds of times, if he discovered about the emails, the calls, the letters, but it was too late now. Her choices, as painful as they were, had ensured the company's success. She had protected Richard as a mother protects her child. "Barbara?" Richard called her, already at the door of the meeting room. "Something wrong?" She forced a smile. "No, nothing. Just thinking about the final details of the event." While the meeting was taking place, Melissa was visiting the atelier where her wedding dress was being finalized. Alone in the fitting room, she looked at her reflection in the mirror and thought about Emily Carter. There was something about Richard's insistence on inviting her that deeply bothered her. As an investigative journalist, before taking over the direction of her family's company, Melissa had learned to trust her instincts. She took her cell phone and typed Emily Carter's name into the search engine. The first image that appeared made her freeze. A photo of 3 identical children with intensely familiar green eyes in front of a school in New York City. The caption indicated that the photo had been taken just 2 months ago during a science fair. Melissa enlarged the image, her heart accelerating. Those eyes. They were undoubtedly Richard's eyes, but how? Why? The questions multiplied in her mind as she realized that the wedding of her dreams was about to turn into something very different from what she had planned. The week leading up to the wedding transformed the Wilson mansion into a true organized chaos. Employees ran from one side to the other, florists delivered immense arrangements, and the sound of hammers and drills echoed through the corridors as temporary structures were set up in the gardens. Melissa observed everything from her temporary room in the mansion, where she would spend the last week of preparations. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the screen of her tablet, where the photo of the triplets remained open. In the last few days, she had discovered more about Emily Carter, her work as a teacher in New York City, her discreet life, and especially the 3 children who constantly appeared in photos of school events. Mrs. Foster, one of the organizers, knocked on the door. "We need to confirm some details of the menu." "Just a moment," Melissa replied, quickly closing the screen. Before leaving, she looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her expression. 6 years as an investigative journalist had taught her the importance of maintaining appearances while gathering information. Downstairs, Richard was personally supervising the assembly of the altar in the garden. Every detail had been meticulously planned to create the perfect scenario, not just for his wedding, but for the moment when Emily would see him move on, happy and successful without her. "The confirmed invitations have already passed 200, Barbara commented, approaching, with a clipboard in her hands. "Including Emily confirmed her presence." Richard smiled, but there was something different about his smile, a mixture of satisfaction and something deeper that Barbara couldn't decipher. "I knew she would come. Emily never knew how to resist a challenge." "Richard," Barbara hesitated, feeling the weight of the secrets she kept. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Sometimes the past should remain in the past." "The past only remains in the past when we give it a proper closure, Barbara," he replied, his voice firm. "Emily needs to see that moving on without her was the best decision I ever made." Meanwhile, in New York City, Emily was finalizing preparations for her trip to Boston. In the boys' room, 3 small suitcases were open on the beds, while she carefully organized the clothes they would wear. "Mom, why do we have to wear suits?" Peter, the most extroverted of the triplets, asked, making a face at the formal attire hanging in the closet. "Because we're going to a very special party," Emily replied, carefully folding the shirts. "And you need to look very elegant." "Is it the party of that important friend you mentioned?" Mark, the most observant, questioned. Emily paused for a moment, her hands resting on the fine fabric of the suit. "Yes, dear, a very important friend." The doorbell rang, and soon Daniel's familiar voice filled the apartment. "Good afternoon, I came to see how the preparations are going." Luke's eyes lit up when he saw the neurologist. "Dr. Johnson, look, Mom bought suits for us." Daniel smiled, but Emily could see the concern in his eyes. After the children left to show off their new shoes, he approached her. "How are you, really?" "Anxious," she admitted, sitting on the edge of Mark's bed. "But ready. Richard needs to meet his children, Daniel, and he needs to understand that his actions have consequences. Do you think he'll react well, a shock like this, on his own wedding day?" "Honestly, I don't know. But he chose to invite me, chose to bring the past back. Now he'll have to deal with the whole truth." In Barbara's office late at night, the executive stared at her computer screen. An email from 6 years ago was open. "Richard, I need to tell you something important. I'm pregnant. Please call me as soon as you can. Love, Emily." Her hands trembled slightly as she moved the mouse to the folder where she digitally kept all the intercepted emails. Hundreds of them, each telling a bit more of the story she had prevented Richard from knowing. In her mind, she repeated the mantra she had created to justify her actions. It was for his own good, for the good of the company, for the future he deserved to have. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her quickly close the file. Melissa entered without knocking, her determined eyes fixed on Barbara. "We need to talk," Melissa declared, closing the door behind her. "About Emily Carter, and about 3 children in New York City who are identical to my fiancé." Barbara's blood froze in her veins. The castle of lies she had so carefully built was beginning to show its first cracks, and the wedding that should have been the pinnacle of her perfect plan was about to turn into something completely different from what she had planned. The day dawned perfect in Boston, as if the weather itself conspired for the grand event. The gardens of the Wilson mansion had been transformed into a fairy tale setting, with thousands of white orchids decorating the path to the altar. Guests began to arrive, filling the environment with whispers of expectation and admiration. In the main room of the mansion, Richard adjusted his tie for the 10th time. His Armani tuxedo had been tailored for the occasion, every detail designed to convey power and sophistication. Through the window, he could see the luxury cars arriving one after another. "Has she arrived yet?" he asked, as soon as Barbara entered the room, without needing to specify who she was. "Not yet," Barbara replied, her voice betraying an unusual nervousness. After her conversation with Melissa the night before, she had barely managed to sleep. "Richard, maybe we should—" "No," he interrupted her firmly. "Today, everything will be exactly as we planned. Emily will see that I not only survived without her, but thrived." On the other side of the mansion, Melissa was sitting in front of the mirror while the makeup artist gave the final touches. Her wedding dress, an exclusive creation that had taken 6 months to be ready, rested delicately on her skin. But her thoughts were far away. "Mrs. Foster," one of the bridesmaids called her softly. "It's time." Melissa nodded, rising with grace. Her discoveries about Emily and the children weighed on her mind, but she had made her decision about how to handle the situation. Years of investigative journalism had taught her that timing was everything. Meanwhile, a taxi was approaching the gates of the mansion. Emily nervously adjusted the navy blue dress she had carefully chosen for the occasion. Beside her, the triplets were impeccable in their small suits, identical down to the last detail. "Remember what we talked about," she said softly. "Behave like the little gentleman you are." "Yes, Mom," they responded in unison, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. The taxi stopped, and Emily felt her heart race. Through the ornate gates, she could see the movement of guests, the sparkle of designer dresses, the clinking of champagne glasses. "Mom," the driver called, "we've arrived." Emily took a deep breath, helping the children out of the car. Immediately, she noticed the curious looks from other arriving guests. 3 identical children were not something you saw every day, especially 3 children who were the mirror image of the groom. "Mom, why are people staring so much?" Luke asked quietly, holding her hand tighter. "Don't worry, dear," she replied, keeping her voice calm despite the turmoil in her chest. "Everything's fine." They began to walk through the garden, and Emily could feel the buzz increasing around. Guests stopped their conversations to observe them, whispers beginning to spread like waves. From her post near the main entrance, Barbara was the first to see them. The blood drained from her face when her eyes fell on the 3 small figures next to Emily. It was like seeing 3 miniatures of Richard, from the green eyes to the shape of the chin. "My God," she murmured, her hands shaking as she sought support on a nearby column. Melissa, who was observing the arrival of guests through a discreet window, felt a strange calm when she saw Emily and the children. It was like watching a scene she had already foreseen, although the reality was even more impactful than the photos she had found. In the room where Richard was waiting for the moment to head to the altar, his cell phone vibrated with a message from one of the organizers. "Miss Carter has arrived with companions." A smile of satisfaction formed on his lips. Emily had fallen into his trap, coming to the wedding probably with some boyfriend to try to provoke jealousy. Little did he know that in a few minutes, his entire world would be turned upside down. The triplets walked elegantly beside their mother, their heads held high as she had taught them, unaware of the impact their mere presence was causing. Peter, always the most observant, noticed Richard's photographs scattered throughout the decoration. "Mom," he whispered, lightly pulling her dress. "That man in the photos, he looks like—" "Yes, dear," Emily replied softly, her heart beating faster and faster. "He looks like you." The moment of truth was approaching. In a few minutes, Richard would come down to greet the guests before the ceremony. In a few minutes, his plan for revenge would transform into something he could never have imagined. In a few minutes, 6 years of secrets, lies, and manipulations would come to light, forever changing the fate of all present. The murmur of guests gradually increased as Emily and the triplets approached the center of the garden. The moment she had imagined thousands of times over the last 6 years was about to happen, and reality seemed even more intense than any scenario she had created in her mind. Barbara, recovering from the initial shock, desperately tried to reach Richard before he came down, but the flow of guests prevented her from advancing quickly. Her fingers trembled as she typed a message on her cell phone. "Richard, wait. We need to talk before—" Too late. The main doors of the mansion opened, and Richard appeared at the top of the marble staircase. Impeccable in his tuxedo, he began to descend the steps with the confidence of someone who believed they had total control of the situation. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for Emily, anticipating the moment of his revenge. When he finally found her, his smile froze. Time seemed to stop. His gaze passed from Emily to the 3 small figures beside her, and it was as if he was looking at photographs of himself as a child. The same eye color, the same face shape, even the way of standing. A perfect copy, multiplied by 3. "Daddy?" Luke's voice cut through the silence that had settled. "Is it him, Mom? Is he our dad?" Richard's world began to spin. His legs weakened, and he needed to lean on the stair railing. The word "dad" echoed in his ears like a deafening bell. Melissa, who had left her room to observe the scene from a strategic point, noticed the exact moment when realization hit her fiancé. She could see the color leaving his face, the tremor in his hands, the shock in his eyes. "Richard," Emily spoke, her voice firm despite the contained emotion. "You're right. We really needed a proper closure. I present to you Mark, Peter, and Luke, your sons." The guests, who until then had been whispering among themselves, fell into complete silence. The only sound that could be heard was the rustling of the leaves on the garden trees. "No, it's not possible," Richard stammered, descending the last steps as if in a trance. "How? Why? Why did you never tell me?" he finally managed to articulate, his voice choked. "Tell you?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "I tried, Richard, hundreds of times, emails, phone calls, letters. For 6 years I tried in every possible way to tell you about them." Barbara felt her legs weaken. Every word from Emily was like a stab in her chest. All the deleted emails, all the blocked calls, all the intercepted letters. Her castle of lies was crumbling. "Mom tried really hard to talk to you." Peter, always the most direct of the 3, took a step forward. "She showed us all the letters she wrote." Richard slowly approached, his eyes scanning every detail of the children's faces. It was like looking at a mirror of the past, multiplied by 3. In Luke, he saw his own childhood shyness. In Mark, he recognized his curiosity. In Peter, he found his determination. "Mr. Wilson," Melissa's voice cut through the air like a blade. She had approached without anyone noticing, still in her wedding dress. "I think we have a lot to talk about." "Melissa, I didn't know." He tried to explain, but the words seemed inadequate, empty. "No, you didn't know," Melissa agreed, her tone surprisingly calm. "But someone knew. Isn't that right, Barbara?" All eyes turned to Barbara, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. Her hands clutched her folder so tightly that her knuckles were white. I did what I thought was necessary," she began, her voice trembling. The company was at a crucial moment. A scandal, an unexpected pregnancy. It could have destroyed everything. "So it was you." Richard took a step in her direction, understanding turning into fury. "You intercepted all of Emily's attempts to contact me. You deprived me of knowing my children. I protected you," Barbara exploded, tears running down her face. "Like my mother couldn't protect me when my father abandoned us. I couldn't let you ruin your future because of an unplanned pregnancy." The silence that followed was deafening. The triplets, sensing the tension in the air, instinctively moved closer to Emily, who hugged them protectively. "Protect?" Richard laughed, humorlessly. "You call this protection? Look at them, Barbara. Look at my children. What you protected was your own position, your own power over me. Melissa took a step forward, her presence commanding everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced in a clear and firm voice, I regret to inform you that there will be no wedding today. The hours that followed the cancellation of the wedding were a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. The guests were politely dismissed, while the main parties involved gathered in the mansion's library, a room that, with its book-lined walls and antique furniture, seemed appropriately solemn for the moment. Melissa had changed from her wedding dress into a more discreet outfit, but maintained the same elegant and determined posture. Seated in one of the leather armchairs, she observed the scene unfolding before her with a mixture of sadness and relief. Why did you never tell me you had discovered about the children? Richard asked her, still trying to process all the events. I wanted to see how far this would go, Melissa replied, her voice calm but firm. I wanted to understand why the man I was about to marry was so obsessed with inviting his ex-girlfriend to our wedding. Now I know it wasn't about Emily, it was about you, about your need to prove something. In a corner of the library, Emily was seated with the triplets. The children, exhausted by the intensity of the day, had fallen asleep on the couch, their heads resting on her lap. Richard couldn't stop looking at them, trying to recover 6 lost years in every detail of their faces. Luke has dyslexia, Emily spoke softly, noticing Richard's gaze. He's being followed by an excellent neurologist. Peter is passionate about chess. He's already won 3 school tournaments. And Mark, well, Mark is our artist. He draws all the time. Every word was like a needle in Richard's heart. So many lost moments, so many firsts that he never witnessed. I should have been there, he murmured, more to himself than to the others. Yes, you should have, Emily agreed without hostility, just stating a fact. But you weren't because someone decided you shouldn't know. All eyes turned to Barbara, who remained seated rigidly in a chair near the window. Her face was marked by tears, but her posture still tried to maintain some dignity. You don't understand, she began, her voice trembling. I saw so many women ruin their careers because of unplanned pregnancies. I saw so many men abandon their dreams because of early responsibilities. I just wanted to protect everything we built. It wasn't your decision to make, Richard replied, his voice laden with contained anger. You manipulated my life, Barbara. You used my trust against me. And you manipulated mine too, Melissa added, rising from her armchair. You let me believe in a story that you knew was false. You allowed me to plan a wedding that was destined to be a farce. Melissa, Richard tried to speak, but she interrupted him with a gesture. No, Richard, you don't need to say anything. In fact, I think you have more important matters to resolve now. She looked significantly at the sleeping children. Emily gently woke the triplets. Boys, I think it's time we go to the hotel. But already, Peter protested sleepily, we barely talked to Daddy. The term Daddy still caused a visible impact on Richard. You could stay here, he suggested hesitantly. The mansion has enough rooms. Not today, Emily replied firmly. It was an intense day for everyone, especially for them. We need time to process all of this. Dr. Johnson must be worried, Luke commented, rubbing his eyes. He always gets worried when we go out. Dr. Johnson, Richard asked, a new tension in his voice. The neurologist who follows Luke, Emily explained. He has been a great support for all of us. Melissa observed the change in Richard's expression upon hearing about Daniel. Even in that moment of chaos, he could still feel jealous. Typical. I'll arrange for a car to take you, Melissa offered, reaching for her phone. It's not necessary, Emily politely refused. I've already called a taxi. As the children said, goodbye. Promising to return the next day, Barbara remained in her corner, watching her professional life crumble before her eyes. Years of dedication, of difficult decisions that she had justified as necessary, all reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. The board will meet tomorrow, Richard announced, looking directly at her. I suggest you prepare your resignation letter. The words fell like a final sentence. The empire that Barbara had helped build, the power she had so carefully cultivated, was all about to slip through her fingers like sand. A week after the cancelled wedding, the Wilson mansion had transformed. The wedding flower arrangements had given way to scattered toys, children's books, and colorful drawings pinned to the refrigerator door. Richard, always so methodical and organized, now found himself learning to navigate the joyful chaos that 3 6-year-old children could create. "Dad, look at this," Peter exclaimed, proudly showing his latest victory in the chess app. It was still strange for Richard to hear the word dad, but each time he heard it, his heart warmed a little more. "Impressive," he smiled, genuinely admiring his son's ability. "Who taught you to play like this?" "Dr. Johnson," Luke answered. Before his brother, his voice carrying that childish admiration that made Richard feel a twinge of jealousy. He said strategy games help the brain work better. In the kitchen, Emily was preparing the afternoon snack, trying to keep the children's routine as normal as possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances. She silently observed how Richard tried to make up for the lost years, sometimes almost desperately. "They need time," she commented softly when the boys went out to play in the garden. "You can't force 6 years of relationship in a week." Richard sighed, running his hands through his hair, a gesture that Emily noticed Mark had inherited from him. "I know, it's just that every time they mention something I missed, every story about first steps, first words." "I kept a diary," Emily revealed, surprising him. "Since I found out about the pregnancy, photographs, videos, every important moment, I was saving it for the day I finally managed to find you." Outside the mansion, Melissa was parking her car. After a week processing everything that had happened, she decided it was time for a definitive conversation with Richard. As she got out of the vehicle, she found Barbara sitting on one of the garden benches. "You shouldn't be here," Melissa commented, without hostility. "I know," Barbara replied, looking much older and more tired than a week ago. "I just wanted to see how they are. The children, they're exactly like he was at their age." Melissa sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "You know what's ironic? Your fear that a child would ruin his career. In the end, it was your attempt to avoid it that caused the real damage." Inside the house, Mark was showing Richard his latest drawings. "This is Dr. Johnson teaching us to ride bicycles," he explained, pointing to a stick figure with a lab coat. "And this is when he took us to see the stars at the observatory." Each mention of the neurologist was like a small blow to Richard. Daniel seemed to have filled all the spaces that should have been his. "You like him a lot, don't you?" "He's nice," Luke answered simply. "He understands how my head works. And he makes Mom smile." Emily, who had just entered the room, froze upon hearing her son's comment. Her eyes met Richard's, which seemed to carry a complex mixture of emotions. "Richard," Melissa called from the door, her presence surprising everyone. "Can we talk?" He nodded, following her to the study. The environment, once his work refuge, was now decorated with the boys' drawings pinned to the walls. "I came to say goodbye," Melissa announced without beating around the bush. "I accepted an offer to run an NGO in San Francisco. I'm going to use my experience to help women who have gone through situations of manipulation and emotional abuse." "Melissa, I'm so sorry for everything." "Don't be," she gently interrupted him. "What happened was terrible, but it was also necessary. You have 3 wonderful children who need you, and I discovered a new purpose." In the garden, Barbara watched the triplets playing, silent tears running down her face. Her resignation letter had been accepted by the board, and her reputation in the corporate world was irreparably tarnished. But seeing those children, so full of life and so similar to the man she had practically raised, she began to question all her certainties. "Sometimes," Emily commented, silently approaching Barbara, "our greatest wounds lead us to hurt others. But that doesn't mean we can't try to fix what we've broken." Barbara looked at her, surprised by the absence of resentment in her voice. "How can you be so understanding after everything I did?" "Because now I have 3 children who need to learn that forgiveness is not weakness," Emily replied simply, "and because holding on to anger only prevents us from moving forward." The Boston autumn painted the garden trees in shades of gold and red, reflecting the changes happening inside the Wilson mansion. After a month of adaptation, a new routine was beginning to establish itself. Richard had transformed one of the rooms into a study space for the triplets, with 3 colorful desks and an interactive whiteboard to help Luke with his reinforcement sessions. "Is the S line like this, Dad?" Luke asked, concentrating on his handwriting exercises. His letters still danced on the paper, but the determination on his face was evident. "Exactly like that," Richard encouraged, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. "Dr. Johnson said you're progressing very well." The mention of the neurologist no longer caused the same discomfort as before. Last week, Richard had finally agreed to meet with Daniel to discuss Luke's treatment. The meeting, which he feared would be tense, proved to be surprisingly productive. "Your son has incredible potential," Daniel had explained, showing Luke's progress over the past few months. "Dyslexia is not an impediment. It's just a different way of processing information. With proper support, he can achieve any goal." In the kitchen, Emily was preparing dinner, while Peter animatedly narrated his latest online chess match. Mark, sitting at the table, was drawing what appeared to be a family portrait, now including both Richard and Daniel in his representation of the world. "Mom," Mark called, holding up his drawing. "Do you think Dr. Johnson will like it? It's for his birthday." Emily smiled, feeling that familiar tightness in her heart. Her relationship with Daniel had transformed in recent months, evolving from a close friendship to something deeper. But now, with Richard back in the boys' lives, everything seemed more complex. "I'm sure he'll love it, dear," she replied, noticing Richard standing in the kitchen doorway. "You really care about him, don't you?" Richard asked after Mark left, to put away his drawing. "He was there for us in the most difficult moments," Emily answered honestly. "When Luke started having problems at school, when other parents made comments about the children not having a present father, Daniel never asked for anything in return, he just offered his support." In her new apartment in downtown Boston, Barbara was organizing documents. After weeks of reflection, she had decided to use her experience differently. With part of her savings, she was structuring a foundation to support single mothers and their children, offering educational and professional support. The phone rang. It was Melissa from San Francisco. "How's the foundation project going?" "Moving forward," Barbara replied, her voice carrying a new purpose. "It's still strange to be on the other side, helping precisely the kind of situation I tried to avoid for so long. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find our true path," Melissa philosophized. "My NGO is growing faster than I expected. The stories of these women, each one of them makes me grateful for having discovered the truth before it was too late." At the mansion, the triplets were getting ready for bed. It was their night to stay with their father, part of the shared custody agreement that Emily and Richard had established. Peter and Mark were already in their beds, but Luke remained in the living room, anxiously waiting. "Dr. Johnson promised to call before bedtime," he explained when Richard asked why he hadn't gone to his room yet. "He always calls on important nights." Richard sat down next to his son, gathering courage for a conversation he knew was necessary. "You like him a lot, don't you?" "Yes," Luke replied with the characteristic honesty of children. "He understands me, and he makes Mom happy. That doesn't mean I like you less, Dad." His son's words hit Richard with unexpected force. All his fear of being replaced, of losing the love of the children he had barely known, seemed small in the face of the simple wisdom of a 6-year-old child. The phone rang, and Luke's face lit up when he saw Daniel's name on the screen. To his surprise, Richard felt a smile form on his lips. "Answer it," he encouraged his son, "and then tell me about these math tricks he's been teaching you." On the other side of town, Emily was walking with Daniel through the park, where they used to take the children. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. "The boys asked if you're coming to the school play next week," she commented, her hands intertwined with his. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," Daniel smiled. "Richard, is he okay with my presence?" "He's learning," Emily replied, stopping to face him. "Just like all of us. Learning that love is not a finite resource. that there's enough room in the children's hearts for everyone who truly loves them. 6 months had passed since the day of the cancelled wedding. The auditorium of the New Horizons Foundation was packed for its inauguration ceremony. In the front rows, the triplets fidgeted restlessly in their suits, while Emily and Daniel tried to keep them behaved. Barbara went up to the stage, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. The audience before her was composed of business people, journalists, and mainly single mothers who would benefit from the project. "A year ago, I believed I knew exactly what was right and wrong," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I made decisions that profoundly affected the lives of people I claimed to want to protect. Today I'm here not to redeem myself, but to transform my mistakes into something positive." In the audience, Melissa smiled discreetly. She had flown from San Francisco especially for the event, where she would also present the work of her NGO, which would now become a partner of the foundation. Richard observed everything from the side of the stage, waiting for his turn to speak. Wearing a more casual suit than his usual ones, he seemed more relaxed, more human. His eyes met Emily's in the audience, and they exchanged a knowing smile, the kind of smile that only people who have been through a long journey together can share. "And now," Barbara announced, "I'd like to call to the stage the president of the board of the New Horizons Foundation, Richard Wilson." Applause filled the auditorium as Richard took his place at the microphone. Peter nudged Mark and Luke, the three straightening up in their chairs to listen to their father. 6 months ago, I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life," Richard began, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "I was so focused on revenge, on proving a point, that I almost lost the chance to meet the greatest blessings of my life, my children." In the audience, Emily held Daniel's hand, who gently intertwined his fingers with hers. Beside her, Luke was scribbling on his new tablet, a joint gift from his father and Dr. Johnson, specially adapted to help him with his studies. "This foundation is born not only as a way to support single-parent families," Richard continued, "but as a reminder that it's never too late to start over, to learn, to grow. Barbara," he turned to his ex-mentor, "you made mistakes, but you're using your experience to create something meaningful. Melissa," he smiled at his ex-fiancée in the audience, "your courage to follow your own path inspired this project." Melissa waved discreetly, her new engagement ring, a gift from her partner in San Francisco, shining under the auditorium lights. "And Emily," Richard turned to the mother of his children, "your strength in raising our children alone, your ability to forgive, and your willingness to let me be part of their lives now. This has taught me more about love and family than all my years of success in business." Peter couldn't contain himself. "That's my dad," he exclaimed, making the audience laugh and Emily blush slightly. "And speaking of family," Richard continued, smiling at his son's interruption, "I learned that it can take many forms. Dr. Johnson," he looked directly at the neurologist, "thank you for taking care of my children when I wasn't present, and for continuing to be an important part of their lives." Daniel nodded respectfully, surprised by the mention. Beside him, Luke smiled proudly. It had been his idea to include the other dad, as he affectionately called Daniel in the speech. After the ceremony, as guests gathered for the cocktail party, the triplets ran among the adults, their laughter echoing through the hall. Mark was showing his latest drawings to Melissa, who had become a sort of favorite aunt. Peter was challenging business people to quick chess matches, impressing everyone with his skill. And Luke, sitting between Richard and Daniel, was animatedly explaining how he was using his new tablet to improve his grades. "Who would have thought," Barbara commented to Emily, observing the scene, "that my greatest attempt to protect Richard would end up bringing us here?" "Life has an interesting way of teaching us," Emily replied, her gaze soft. "Sometimes our greatest fears lead us to our greatest learnings." In the center of the hall, Richard observed his family, not the one he had planned to have, but the one that destiny, with all its ironic wisdom, had gifted him. The triplets, who were his image, reflected 3 times, each with their unique personality. Emily, who had become a partner in raising the children and a respected friend. Daniel, who brought balance and wisdom to the family dynamic. Melissa, and Barbara, who had transformed adversity into purpose. "Dad," Peter called, interrupting his thoughts, "let's show everyone the presentation we prepared." The triplets had insisted on preparing something special for the inauguration, a small presentation where each would demonstrate their talent. Peter with his chess, Mark with his art, and Luke with a small speech he had practiced tirelessly. As the children prepared, Emily approached Richard. "They're so happy," she commented. "We all are," he replied, watching Daniel join the boys to help them with the final preparations. "In a different way than we imagined, but maybe it's exactly as it should be." The triplets' presentation was received with warm applause, especially when Luke, overcoming his shyness, dedicated his words of thanks to his two dads, a declaration that, months ago, would have caused tension, but now brought smiles to the faces of all present. The night ended with a family photo, not a traditional family, but one that had learned that love, forgiveness, and acceptance are the true foundations of any relationship. On everyone's faces, one could see not just contentment, but the peace that comes from finding one's place in the world, even if that place is different from what was initially planned.